Those of you, thank you, Sante. Those of you who were listening to the radio today know that there was a meltdown on radios all over New York City with the panelists who stepped forward into our microphones today. At one point, I had to check to see if we were still on the air because they were throwing down some very serious business. And it's some business that deals out of a dimension that relates to what I call the information age. I've made a statement that many of you have heard before, that in the information age, what you don't know can kill you. And what we're beginning to see is that there are people who understand that in the information age, what you do know can build you. And as we begin to build this pyramid of consciousness, people are getting very upset. They're getting extremely upset. I saw a phenomenon take place before I went to Kemet with Dr. Ben, where an 8-page article came out on me in a magazine called Harper's. This is a magazine that you really only see if you happen to be in your dentist's office. And that's the only way you would ever read it, basically. Because it's not a magazine directed to our community at all. If you were in your doctor's office or your dentist's office, you might happen to see it and you might pick it up by accident. So I saw this 8-page piece in which they attempted to analyze my show. At one point, the writer said that I had the unique ability to make people angry without ever raising my voice. He called it the only radio show with an ideology that life is a Darwinian struggle for racial advantage. It is, and he was right. We understand that. We're very, very clear about that. Life is a Darwinian struggle for racial advantage. There are things that people have not wanted us to know. They are scared to death that we know now. Today on our broadcast, at one point, when I'm in the middle of that thing and I'm sharing my thoughts and I'm in the middle of it, it's like lightning bolts that are going on, and the brothers are throwing and oh man, see that one, And what's great is that I can see the brothers and sisters because we have the live audience and I see them get short. Many of us have experienced. I've been the beneficiary, just as many of you have, over the last several years, of a tremendous amount of information that has changed me, it has changed my life, it has transformed my consciousness. We are approaching the 21st century. Why should we think that we're going to operate with the same information as brothers and sisters who preceded us? It is our obligation to surpass them and all that they knew and all that they did. But we can only do it through the efforts of brothers and sisters who somehow managed to figure out in their life survival plan how to put the kind of concentration together that ultimately results in the books, ultimately results in the lectures and the dialogues and so forth, that when we hear them, we find that we can listen to them for whether it be 30 seconds or 30 minutes or 3 hours and literally have our consciousness completely transformed. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the names that we have here tonight. Dr. John Henrik Clarke, Dr. Amos Wilson, and of course, Attorney Alton Maddox. I've had a lot of reporters come to me lately. I started seeing, this is the same show we've been doing, the past 7 years or so, and I've been to New York now. I found out recently, which was interesting, I have the longest running black radio program in the history of New York, 22 years. I always have to tell people in terms of Reverend Sharp, and I said, well, I started when I was 5, so just a young brother, right? But what has happened is, and what we're beginning to observe and beginning to see, is that radio as a medium can be used in ways that we haven't used it before. I was a DJ for a number of years, and when I attempted to start doing the things that I was doing on the radio at that time, I did them because I just wasn't satisfied. I couldn't keep playing 22 minutes of music in a row and 58 minutes of this and that. I said, said, we got to do something because this is too valuable a tool. I've been very blessed and very fortunate that because of brothers and sisters like yourself, I've been able to maintain that kind of position. In 1971, when I was in danger of losing my position for doing some of the same things that I do today, it was H. Rap Brown who called the general manager of the radio station. It was the Black Panther Party who called until they burned the station down. So I know how I'm there. I know why I'm there, and I made a very specific My dedication is to my community. My dedication is to the global Black experience. That is what we are doing. Now, you know, I had, let's see, 60 Minutes sent over 3 reporters. I said, who? 60 Minutes? What are they here for? No cameras, what is it? They wanted to just sit, hang out at the radio show. They were just there to hang out, they said. They just wanted to just kind of suck it all up or something, you know. Governor Cuomo called in the middle of the broadcast that they came. And Cuomo called with Reverend Sharpton sitting right next to me. And they were having a conversation. And you know me and I like to talk. So we just talking back and listen. Somebody had me believe it. Oh, Reverend Sharpton, the governor is on the line. He wants to come over there to talk. This is right in the Crown Heights situation. So I said, okay. So I said to Reverend there, I said, you down with this? He said, sure, no problem with it. I said, okay. I said, well, tell the governor he can join us in the conversation at 1 o'clock, right after the news. So the message came back to me, and as this message was being given to him, in walked Reverend Henrik Dr. and Attorney Colin Moore. Now, I didn't know they were coming, you know, they were just coming to hang out, you know. And so I said, well, let's send another message to the governor and let him know that my other guests are Reverend Henrik Dr. and Attorney Colin Moore and Reverend Sharpton, and he can come on and he can talk and say what he has to say. And we'd like to talk. The governor said that he didn't want to have a conversation with them. He just wanted to talk to me. You come into my living room, I have members of my family, not guests. And you say you want to just talk to me and not the members of my family? No kind of disrespect like that. Not today. Not today before we are. Not at this time. But the point I make here, though, is that the divide and conquer tactic was at work in the moment. Now, CBS came to ask me these questions, and where did this show come from? From outer space somewhere. The next day after CBS came, Peter Jennings' World News Tonight called. They sent a camera crew. 2 weeks after that, the New York Post article came out. Harper's, CBS, ABC, the New York Post. So now I know what that means. We're talking about target practice. But I want them to understand I'm protected by a much higher force than they've ever come to understand. I began to try to put together, going into the Crown Heights situation, what was our experience? What was our perception? Why did people think that it just happened at Crown Heights? Why did they think it was one single incident that made the Black community say, enough is enough? Why were we saying no justice, no peace? Why did we keep saying that? So when the reporters kept asking us, I need to write something, And I wrote a little something, which will introduce our program for this evening because it deals with the very subject that we're going to talk about, which is global white supremacy. This is no justice, no peace, just a bit of it. face in the crowd. Yo, brother, man, you looking proud. Sister love, you got it too. I wish they all could be like you. We are people with a job to do. Struggle to us is nothing new. Historic, running through our minds with images of every kind. Cowboys and Indians, we all rooted for them to win. Wars, we were proud to fight, but they never did try to treat us right. Hair had to be like theirs, thin nose, blue eyes, and oh so fair. School, where there was no book with people who looked like you. Time and time again, there were those who tried to do us in, but survive we did. And here we are, we had to come from very far. And now we say that this must cease. With no justice, there is no peace. We say, no justice, no peace. Check it out, racism must cease. Then he say, no justice, no peace. We got to take it to the streets. Now check this out. No other people around the world have had their family stolen, hurled across the land or over the sea. The branches of our family tree, we too have a Holocaust, and millions strong were killed and lost. They didn't come by invitation, they were brought here to build a nation. We slaved and worked this land. I'm talking about the Africans, the ones their ships went out to raid, the ones on the sand never paid. Now we, the children of the sun, are the new generation under the gun. We watch today on TV news as groups of angry Hasidic Jews storm into a police station, suffer no kind of retaliation. Put a single black man in that situation, and he'd be dead by assassination. No justice, no peace. We say racism must cease. We say no justice, no peace. Indeed, it's time to take it to the streets. And that's what it's about, brothers and sisters. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. Racism must cease. And when we say racism must cease, we are talking about global white supremacy. Let's begin our program tonight by introducing our very distinguished panel. They are all very honored brothers. We start with the first, who is our honored elder, Dr. Henrik Clarke. Also in the house, let me bring up Attorney Alton Max and Dr. Amos Wilson. In relationship to what took place today, and what we began to do with, most of you know the format, our programming today and this evening is going to deal with this particular subject of global white supremacy from three different perspectives. The historical perspective, the psychological perspective, and the legal perspective. They are all very much tied together. We'll begin the proceedings this evening with Dr. Henrik Clarke on the historical issue of global white supremacy. Dr. Clarke.
Thank you very much. One of the main reasons we don't understand is that we don't understand white people, and we don't understand how old we were when we discovered the world. Half of human was over before we knew there was anything in the world that identified itself as being white. We had already built enduring civilization. The pyramids were already there. Nile Valley civilization was already there. There was peace. There was no Rome. Before before we knew there were people called white. For years, no people in the world were identified by a color. White people as white by identification is a creation of the 15th and the 16th century. I don't mean they began to exist then, but they began to identify themselves by color then. Yellow people were not identified as yellow, blacks were not identified as blacks. And the first inkling of intelligence we know came out of Europe about 1250 BC. A piece of folklore, the Odyssey and the Iliad, written by a person named Homer. We're not too clear whether Homer was man or woman. Living in those caves, the caves are kind of dark. They would develop a gender situation different from the tropical people who live out into the light.
Right.
So now, my point is that if you built enduring civilizations before you knew he existed, laid the basis of the world religions, the basis for science, the basis for social thought, built systems more perfect than anything called socialism, built social orders better than anything he later called Christianity, built it without a dogma and without a book. You didn't proclaim it to be so, you just lived it out. Once you proclaim something to be so, I suspect you don't believe it. Now, so the African never said in his spiritual way of life, I am my brother's keeper. He just kept it. That people had no state. That people had no specific name. That people, being raised in cold and ice, developed a temperament. A temperament that would later threaten the whole world. An icebox temperament. Just like the Arab developed a sand temperament. Slave traders. We will not deal with this. And I'm not dealing with it tonight, but I'm saying that there are too many closed doors in history. We got to open and examine a skeleton. Now, what interfered with this African peaceful way of life? Well, there were no jails because no one had ever gone to one. No orphanages because no one had ever thrown away children. That's right. No old people's home because no one ever threw away grandma. What happened to the coming of farmers? I'm trying to deal with now his discovery of us and what he discovered about us is something we still do not know about ourselves that fastens him on our back and makes him disrupt our nation our family life, our individual relationships, one to the other. We have always been, and we still are, the world's richest people. There have always been people coming from stingy climate who wanted to take what we had without paying for it. And so to take what we had without paying for it, they've got to establish a rationale to say that we are less than other human beings deserving less consideration. These same people will adopt a religion and say God is good, God is kind. But they will solicit their God to assist them in oppression, therefore making God ungodly. Because all organized Western religion, and that includes Judaism, we're going to move the podium back so you can see, Christianity, and Islam, a male chauvinist murder cult, they've always used religion as a rationale for taking away the freedom of other people, infringing upon the rights of other people in the name of their God. Therefore, taking the godliness from their God and making him a partner in that crime. Right. Now, the sand people came out of scarcity, and the ice people came out of scarcity. They would launch an assault on some people who had plenty because nature had favored them. They would create concepts. The concept of the chosen by God. And if you say God chose you to do something for another people over and above other people, then God is a bigger. Then if another one say, I will declare holy war on you because you don't belong to my faith. That everything within my faith is an abode of peace, and everything outside of my faith is an abode of war. Then you're saying God is a cutthroat and a thug. People came among a people who had a different way of life. This may be painful to you to know this, but I say to the everlasting credit of African people, they gave the world no religion. What the African people gave the world is higher than religion. They gave it universal spirituality. All religion, no exception, all religion were taken from the universal spirituality created by God. The is against the poor use they made of these religions. Right. There was nothing basically wrong with creating these religions. There's something wrong with what they did with it, because all of them indulged slavery. Exactly. Notice that. Notice that. If God is grace and God is love, then God is not an endorser of slavery. Now, how then did he come out of this icebox and in as much as organized religion, organized societies in Western Asia, North Africa, great city-states down the coast of East Africa, organized cities in inner Africa, the Sudan, coal mining. We read so few pages of a book, if you just read a whole book once in a while. Just pick up one of Shakin's idea books and read from cover to cover. J.C. DeGrasse Johnson's little book, African Gold, you can read that in one evening. And Professor Joseph Harris' book, Africa in their African people in their history, you can read that in a good long evening. So no one is hiding this information from you, and I'm not telling you anything that I didn't get from books and documents gathered dust in libraries that's open to you as well as me. Now I'm trying to put this in some kind of sequence. At what point in human history did we see someone who would later call themselves European? I maintain that the Greeks and the Romans have no just claim for being Europeans, and that Europe assisted them in no way in coming into being, because at the time of Greece and Rome, there was no Europe. There wasn't a single European organized state. Yet every Scandinavian schoolboy can claim Greece and Rome as part of its intellectual heritage. Egypt stretches 4,000 miles into Africa, because it is a Nile Valley civilization and not an Egyptian civilization. Yes. All right. And if people came from the south, because the Nile Valley was a great culture highway, and Egypt is physically in the body of Africa. So the dispute about Egypt not being African and being white makes no sense. It's a part of global white supremacy, because this inactive, insecure man who hadn't thought out from the icebox must claim things that didn't belong to him. All right, now, let us, for the sake of conversation, say that Egypt was white. Egypt stretches 4,000 miles into Africa. Come on. Egypt emerged when the Ice Age was just starting out in Europe. While these Europeans come from under the ice, go all the way to Africa, build the pyramids, go back into Europe under the ice. And stay under the ice 2,000 years before they build a shoe for themselves and a house for the winter. It don't make sense. So if Egypt was white, It got its workers from the South. It got a lot of its material from the South. And the interaction between these white Egyptians and these black Africans going on 3,000 years, could they still be white? Just for a conversation, I make them white. And even that don't make sense. My main point is that with the emergence of Rome and Greece, you better stop thinking about Rome and Greece as being part of Europe, because there wasn't no Europe for it to be part of. There was no functioning Europe. Rome and Greece began to appear at the time the ancient African world was about over. Europe was not a part of the ancient world. Europe emerged at the beginning of the present modern world. And if you read a work called Europe in the Modern World, Coulson and Palmer, they said there was no Europe in ancient times. Now, who was there to feed Rome and Greece? These two Mediterranean nations got their impetus from islands in the Mediterranean, Greece, Minoans, Western Asia, and from Egypt. And finally they got themselves together. And once they got themselves together, just at the time Africa, after nearly 10,000 years of civilization, was in decline, they got hungry. And like a spiteful child, turned on its intellectual mother and father. Now, global white supremacy started with the smugness and the arrogance of the Romans and the Greeks. They were better intellectually. But while saying better intellectually, they were still sending their children to African schools.
That's right.
After Greece got it underway, Africa had suffered several invasions from Western Asia, mistakenly called the Middle East. And one of the last of these terrible invasions, 550 BC, the Africans cried out, "Oh God, if you cannot send me a liberator, send me a conqueror who will show mercy." Now, when the young Alexander knocked at the door, weary of Western Asian conquerors, and having no concept of race or color as part of their culture, he walked right in. He was a conqueror like all conquerors. He was a raider like all of them. He raided the granary of Egypt. And while there, the first thing he noticed is that Africa was the home of the Greek gods. Zeus and Apollo came from that. He wrote his mother, "At last I've come to the home where Greece started." He recognized it, said it, put it down, and began to steal from African libraries and send it to his schoolmaster, Aristotle. Right. Aristotle rearranged these books and put his name on it, and they helped to lay the basis for Greek philosophy. Now here's called the Greek stealing, white supremacy through the colonization of other people's culture and calling it their own. Right. They would do the same thing with countries. Finally, Alexander and his group loses power after beginning something which we have not discussed. It is disaster among us sometimes, but we don't even talk about it. Bastardization. Begin to bastardize, blacken down, lighten up, decomplexion, create a generation with a confusion between whether they should be loyal to their mother's people or their father's people. All right. We still got them around. Don't know the way home, go knock at their father's door, you don't belong to me. He signed you, but no, got no home in your father's house. They come among us and expect special privileges. And most of the time they get them. We're not too clear sometimes as to who's loyal to who. Now I'm not dealing with, when I deal with bastardization, I deal with the physical bastardization, but I also deal with the mental bastardization. I know blacks who are black as tar, who are stone traders. You can mutilate the mind, you can mutilate the body. One is as bad as the other. Now, the Romans came into Africa in an act of genocide, the destruction of Carthage. No reason has been given in history for the destruction of Carthage other than the fact that the Romans wanted to control this great commercial city. Now we see the projection of this supremacy in the Mediterranean. This is almost the rehearsal for global white supremacy. The Romans finally began to talk among themselves. Carthage must be destroyed. Yes, Carthage must be destroyed. Good morning, Roman. Good morning, Roman. Carthage must be destroyed. Roman said, yes, Carthage must be destroyed. Good night, Roman. Carthage must be destroyed. Yes, Carthage must be destroyed. Ain't nobody said why. Finally, when they pushed Hannibal back and destroyed Carthage, they had to hire Carthaginians to try to help rebuild it. They'd never seen a city like this. They'd never seen viaducts, water preserves. And the Romans not only destroyed the city, they put salt in the land, plowed salt in the land to keep the crops from growing. The Romans, so accustomed to killing people, started killing animal life. This drove the elephants and all the animal life, lions, out of North Africa. They had to go deep into Africa to find lions for the arena. The Romans began to laugh at people practicing the basis of an early religion called early European formation called Christianity. Now you have to separate Christianity as practiced by the Africans 3,000 years or more before the coming of Christ. And you're eventually going to have to get up enough nerve to separate Islam from Africa and Arab and to make a clear distinction between Islam and Arabism. A whole lot of people didn't make that distinction. That's right. The Arab is a racist dog. That's right. And a slave trader. That's right. White wannabes sometimes are worse than whites. We got to deal with other white wannabes. Right. Because every white wannabe tries to improve his condition with the whites by proving to them they can hold us in check. Right. Certain ethnic groups are assigned to hold us in check. And they get their brownie points with white to the extent they can do that. Now, these Romans began to persecute people called Christians. They began to have fun, entertainment, killing these Christians. Then finally one day, a Roman emperor looked down in the arena and saw his uncle being among the Christians going to be killed. Well, he's crazy anyway, let him go. The next Saturday, he looked down at his wife and son was there. To stop this show. They had joined the religion. Constantine, a degenerate, made Christianity the official religion of the Holy Roman Empire. Now if you're so sacred now, thin skinned, I'm trying to prove to you that a lot of global white supremacy came through the religions of the world. Judaism, Christianity, and a special rationalization for slave trade came through Islam. Exactly. I'm saying that none of these three religions have proven to be our friend. In their invasion of Africa, in their influence in Africa, they misinterpreted the African interpretation of their religion. Instead of affecting a wedding between themselves and Africa's interpretation of the same religion, they turned on the African interpretation and enslaved his mind and subsequently enslaved his body. Everybody that came into Africa did Africa more harm than good. The African never understood these people. Didn't understand them then, don't understand them now. When Christianity became the religion of the Holy Roman Empire, Rome declared war on the African Christian for the control of the church. It's a little known war in history. My point is that global white supremacy manifests itself in that no matter what they believe and say they believe, religiously or politically, they are going to be in charge. Right. All right. And that racism does not stop at the door of communism or socialism or Christianity or Islam or Judaism. I am not asking you to discard any religion that you belong to. I'm telling you to convert everything that you belong to into an instrument of liberation, or throw it into the ash can of it. As the major sufferers of racism, you should not belong to racist institutions or rationalize about any of it. Now, after the Roman mismanagement of this church reached the point of disgrace until the African Christian turned on the Roman Christians, there were more Africans killed in the arena, in the amphitheaters of North Africa, than in the arena in Rome. You know about the arena in Rome because Caesar Peter Mills have told you about it. So nobody made any great movies about all the murder of the African Christians. Now, after this period and the corruption and the fight, the internal fight within the Christian church in North Africa, Byzantium, Southern Europe, and Western Asia, the African grew disenchanted over the mutualization of a religion he had created. A camel boy delivering goods for his uncle began to grumble and talk to other camel boys. He was not a great reader now. Most people do not know that most of our gods could not read and write. Buddha might have been an exception. But I didn't say he wasn't brilliant. A whole lot of brilliant people can't read and write. And then he asked for reform. Had he gotten reform, he might have been satisfied. Failing to get reform, he called for a new religion. This new religion was Islam. Africans saw that Islam, a new force, would help them get the Romans off of their back. They were right. Islam got the Romans off of the Africans' back, but replaced the Romans on the Africans' back. And yet the African was the military arm of that religion almost for the first 1,000 years of its existence. It was an African general that would take them into Spain, Jabal Tarak, Tarek bin Azad, with two Africans, Zayd bin Harit, the first military man of the faith, Bilal, the first Mazoom, the caller of the prayer, who the prophet wanted as his successor. Exactly. How different this religion would have been had this Ethiopian taken over the faith. Now, the Africans and the Arabs had pushed the European out of the Mediterranean. He's going to block the European into that Mediterranean for the next 800 years. Found it as grumbling within Europe itself. They are hungry. And an offbeat Peter the Hermit began to complain about the Arabs preventing them from going to the holy places, see the Holy Grail. So they're going to rescue the Holy Grail. But the Holy Grail itself, which is another myth, wasn't in danger, nor was it lost. Now the basis of the crusade is this. The Catholic Church, in raising money for those big cathedrals and all that gold piping where the priests lived like gods, were fleecing the people. And they created something called purgatory. Grandma is not in heaven. Grandma is in purgatory. So you give so much money, they're going to pray grandma from purgatory into heaven. It was a religious racket. And when it pinned up, when the pulse pinned up inside of Europe to turn on the church for it, the Crusades came and Europe had a drain off. So the Pope let them march. And they go marching across Europe and they forget their case. This might be a stereotype, but it's almost like a black man sometimes when he gets angry with you, I say avoid him 24 hours, he might forget about it. But we're passion killers. If we don't kill you in a hurry, we might forget about it. Now, These crusades, mostly raping parties, the famines and the plague left Europe drained, left Europe hungry. They had forgotten longitude and latitude. They would learn this from the University of Salamanca, where the Africans and the Arabs had preserved the maritime skill coming out of China. The Europeans would take this information, build ships again, and turn on the people who preserved it. They were on their way to Asia and discovered big Africa in the way. They would begin the sanction of the slave trade. Now, a little-known sailor said that for 23 years I sailed up and down the Guinea coast. What Christopher Columbus doing up and down the coast of West Africa for 23 years? Before 1492. He was in the Portuguese slave trade.
All right.
The Europeans came down the coast of West Africa, taking slaves, trading in commodities at first, then slaves. But it wasn't much for the slave to do between the time they entered in 1438, the time they took the first large number of slaves out in 1442. After 1492, it would get on the way. But 1455, in a dispute between Spain and Portugal, after the Africans had lost a great part of Spain, Africans and the Arabs, the Pope would say to Spain and Portugal, you are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people. Now you see the church sanction of what's going to become global white supremacy. Most of the infidels were black. They came down the coast of West Africa looking for an emperor called Prester John, an African Christian who they thought would help them. Having not found them, they would turn on the very Africans that they said in their early journals was as civilized to the marrow of their bones. Now this dirty trade is getting underway. The slave trade would rescue the economy of Europe and install global white supremacy. It would introduce the plantation system in the Caribbean islands. Its brutality would start the revolts in the Caribbean islands. It would start a concept of scientific racism. They would again turn to the scriptures to justify racism. Most of the sea captains were not only racist, but they were Christian racists who get a load of ships and pray for a good wind to take them away. And one of the famous hymns in the church, How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds, was written by a slave master, a slave captain. Now you can see now how Christianity was recruited to justify the partnership between the European and his religion and the enslavement of the African. You can see how the chosen people concept was a rationale for the Hebrew cooperation with the trade. A rationale is to clear your consciousness. It's like the Mormons said that we have no souls. So if something's done to you, you have no soul, then there's no guilt. There's no guilt to declare you a people without a soul. and to create a rationale that I'm doing this to spread enlightenment. Many of the Catholics would sprinkle them. Now my point is that after 1600, the world would never be the same again. England had entered the trade. The Pope had justified the trade from the point of view of the Catholic Church. Scholars had begun a concept of scientific racism. The European continued the racism started by Rome and Greece. And this would continue until the fight against slavery was not a fight against slavery for benevolent reasons, but because it became unwieldy and everybody who could afford one had one. And they were breeding them in any way. England was never sincere in this regard. In the United States, slavery was basically a New England business. The South had no ships to send to go bring back any slaves. The Yankee clipper outran the British ship, and this is the basis of the War of 1812. Now, I'm going to try to sum this up because I feel the Baptist preacher in me getting the best of me. We do not idly take any of this. In the United States, we had 100 years of slave revolts. In the Caribbean islands, they had more than 100 years of slave revolts. Only their revolts were more successful than ours because they had a culture continuity. You might not think it looking at Caribbean people and listening to Caribbean people today, that they have a great revolutionary heritage when they're running to other people's bloodstream. In the United States, we fought longer and harder. But there was no victory for us because we were surrounded all the way. Of all the Africans away from home, this black American had the hardest fight and still have the hardest fight and have the least understanding. And have the least understanding from other African people of his plight. We have to rise each morning and beg for the right to live to the end of the day. Europe dumped its human garbage can into the New World. The worst of that garbage can was dumped into the United States. But at the end of the 19th century, 100 years of slave revolts in the United States, 100 years of rebel revolts in the Caribbean islands, 100 years of anti-colonial revolts in Africa. The African world began to come together at the end of that 19th century. H. Sylvester Williams began to develop a concept of Pan-Africanism. The Caribbean islands began to demand some form of constitutional government. The great literature of solidification and self-identification was coming from a large number of Caribbean scholars. They had been coming to the United States since the early 18th century. They did not identify themselves as Caribbean scholars. We did not call ourselves names. We did not identify islands. We stopped boasting about whether slave ships put us down, because all of us were sure where the slave ship took us from. All of us came fighting and bleeding and hoping from that magnificent 19th century into the 20th century. And while we have not understood ourselves as well as we should in the 20th century, that we have not understood that 19th century. That was the basis of Pan-African nationalism. I see no hope of overcoming global white supremacy for African people except a world union of African people throughout the world.
Your text of global white supremacy, a historical overview of the economy of thought. Yeah, you came over on different ships, but you all in the same boat now. You understand that? That's what I'm learning. No doubt. Well, we continue in this discussion. This is about commercial interruption. And I like this vibration. A bit earlier today on our broadcast, the next brother who is about to come up and speak sent many of us on a psychological star trip. We're talking about galactic stuff. Now, we had a program tonight that was called The Effects of Global White Supremacy. And when this brother began talking about the psychological effects, he pointed out to us that perhaps we were limiting the domain of the conversation in a way that was impractical, considering where the world was moving to and where it had come from in most recent years. He pointed out that the United States had landed on the moon. And that since they had landed on the moon, we can no longer call it global white supremacy. You don't have to call it galactic white supremacy. Because when they landed on the moon, as was pointed out today, they did not plant a flag for the United Nations. They planted a flag in red, white, and blue, beginning the colonial exploration of our space. That is where he comes from. That is the kind of perspective that he shares with us in terms of opening our minds to the effects, psychologically speaking, of global white supremacy. Let us welcome Dr. Amos Wilson.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back here with you this evening. It's been a while. I want to thank you very much for your response to our last publication, Black on Black Violence. It has been magnificent. We're asking you to look forward to about 3 other publications starting around December. One dealing with maximizing the intelligence of African American children, which we expect to be out toward the end of November. Another dealing with European historiography, and a third dealing with European diagnoses. But our main magnus opus will bear, at this point, the working title, Educating the African American Child for the 21st Century. And that's a working title. We're going to offer you about 500 or 600 pages of real working advice for getting our generation ready to end white supremacy. I want you also to look forward to some communications flyers from the Pan-African Research and Development Foundation and its subsidiary organization called, for now, the African Scholarum. We have just acquired a new space on 138th Street in the Bronx. And from there, we will enter a phase of economic development, and we will discuss and develop theories and approaches in terms of international economic development, military strategy, and other very practical and real political means of overcoming the situations that we are in. We're going to ask you in the future then to join with us over there to build a loan fund and an economic fund. Brother Maddox anticipated me today when he talked about the central bank. We were already moving in that direction and the whole bit, so stay tuned. We at the Pan-African Research and Development Foundation are very, very much concerned with combining scholarship, combining research with very practical results. And those of you who have an interest in putting your knowledge to work, I hope then you would look forward to working with us. We're going to talk a bit today about the effects of white global supremacy. And as I mentioned this morning, we are now dealing here with what I might call the effects of white galactical supremacy, in that the European has entered the space race and is expecting to duplicate in space what he has done on this globe, to colonize space itself and to carry his racist orientations into the very universe. I've often talked about this phase of European development in terms of what it means for Africans and what African and an Afrocentric education must be about. The European of Star Wars, we have a situation here today with all types of exotic weaponry. We spoke this morning about psycholinguistics. And it's interesting that the European calls Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative. And this has deceived many people. Against whom is the European defending himself in space? What we really must recognize here is a strategic offensive initiative. The European placing weaponry so far above the earth that no other nations can meet him there and destroy those weapons. It means then that the European will place himself in a position to rain weapons on the African continent and of African people with impunity. African flying jet planes and so forth will not be able to stand up against this type of warfare. This is why I've often urged people to understand that the education of our children and the education of ourselves goes beyond preparing for jobs. It speaks to the defense of our very lives. And therefore, African education and Afrocentric education must take us into the space age, where we must again prepare to fight a battle of liberation. We see here, and some years ago, I saw magazines called Commercial Space. The European already exploring the commercial uses of space, the mining of planets. I've told people if you're in the transportation business, you should already be planning transportation to and for from the moon and other planets. If you're in the trucking business, you have to now start thinking about trucking merchandise, people, and other wares to the planets. If the European is able to find minerals and other kind of wealth on the planet, he will not, on other planets, he will not even have to pay the African for the wealth that he steals from him today. We are seeing here then a situation where the European is seeking to gain supremacy over the total universe. His drive for total control has not been subdued by any means. He is seeking to control life itself. If you read the New York Times this week, Monday, October 21st, 1991, you'll see on the front page, U.S. seeks patents on genetic codes, setting off furor. Health agency bypasses normal procedure of waiting until genes' role is known. So here people want to patent the very sources of life themselves, the genes, and to make people pay for licenses to derive benefits from their functioning. It states here, in a move that has set off an international scientific furor, the federal government is seeking to patent hundreds of human genes before knowing what role they play in the body. So just as they are planting the flag on the moon, before they know what it contains, they now want to plant a flag on the very basis of human life, the genetic codes, before they know what they are all about. And he goes on to talk about courts having allowed researchers to patent human genes, which means, of course, in essence, the European wants to create new forms of life and hold patents on those new forms of life. But until now, researchers have applied for patents only after they have determined a gene's role in the body and its potential commercial uses. In a sharp departure from that practice, officials of the National Institutes of Health applied in June for a patent that would cover rights to 340 pieces of genetic code, most of which have yet to be deciphered. Officials said they may soon apply for a second patent that would cover an additional 1,500 sequences. Although genes are products of nature, the courts have ruled that a gene may be patented if it has been isolated and purified in a way that is not found in nature. A very interesting situation here. But top scientists in the United States and Europe say they fear that the move could start a scientific version of a land rush. So you see again how history just repeats itself in new forms and new shapes. But the basic orientation continues. With billions of dollars at stake for the same motives, billions of dollars at stake, in which governments and companies race to claim territory on the sets of genes that govern everything in the body before actually unraveling the secrets of this human genome. So what do we have? The United States and Europe still trying to claim the bodies of all people and claim the very basis of life itself. As they say, the French say, the more things change, the more they remain the same. We see it going on and on again. What is white supremacy? We'll look quickly in the light of our time situation here to George Frederickson's definition, viewing white supremacy as referring to the attitudes, ideologies, and policies associated with the rise of blatant forms of white or European domination over non-white populations. It's very important that we understand the nature of this thing we call white supremacy. Related to that definition, of course, is the one dealing with racism, I think best expressed by David T. Wellman in his book, Portraits of Racism. Racism can be seen to systematically provide, and this is why it is not going to pass away until we destroy it ourselves. It can be seen to systematically provide economic, political, psychological, and social advantage for whites at the expense of blacks and other people of color. The determining feature of race relations is not prejudice toward blacks. but rather the superior position of whites and institutions, ideological as well as structural, which maintain it. We don't have time to explain this particular definition, but I think it's very interesting in that it speaks to an issue we often get caught up on, and that is one of viewing racism as an expression of attitudes, as an expression of stereotypes. But racism moves far beyond stereotypes. Whites can refuse to express stereotypes and racist attitudes in public and still maintain their positions of supremacy. In fact, as they secure their institutions, as they secure economic control, as they secure technological superiority, they reduce quite often their racist invective. However, their supremacy and control over the lives and destinies of African people continues, if not really increases in its potential. Therefore, we cannot waste a lot of time in looking at racism as mere expressions of attitudes and mere expressions of stereotypes. We must look at the very organization of European society itself as the basis for white supremacy. The very structure and functionality of European institutional structures and legal systems and other ideologies, and our believing in those ideologies, and our believing that we must submit ourselves to those laws that maintains supremacy. For we'll find, as I have warned audiences before, that white racism at some point will appear to be faceless, in that it will not be immediately obvious, but it will still continue to operate. Racism is more effectively analyzed as a strategy for the maintenance of privilege than as prejudice. If we view racism as a culturally sanctioned, and I'm still reading Wellman here, rational response to struggles over scarce resources. And this is the thing I wish we had time to talk about today. And I talk about this often in terms of what it means to be a man, and what manhood means, and what men are developed for, and the role of men in the world. Because we have to recognize the fundamental fact that people have to struggle over resources, and men must be prepared to win those struggles for their people.
Right. Yeah.
And we have to keep that in mind. And we can account for its widespread character and avoid the inconsistencies and meaningless distinctions that arise when it is viewed as prejudice. In other words, racism is about the distribution of wealth. It's about the
This is cosmic sparks flying tonight. There's no doubt about that. Well, our next guest is a brother. Our brother who is a revolutionary in every sense of the word. His understanding of courtroom technology, theory, and the law are really only surpassed by what we all understand is his total commitment to the liberation of African people worldwide. When we look over the years of the Republican domination of this country, one has to go back, and those of us who were around a good 20 years ago with some level of consciousness remember a term called law and order. And it was a very key political strategy that the Republican administration began putting forward at that time, and that ultimately has given them very much a hold on the White House, with the exception of President Carter and a very brief interruption that occurred. We have seen Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Bush. And they all have basically taken that particular theme of law and order and used it in various methods to ultimately exploit their own particular aims and objectives towards us as a people and towards what some feel is the genocide of us as a people. This particular brother was able to beat them in the ring of law and order. There are many cases that come to mind when you think of Brother Alton Maddox. I recall at one point when Reverend Al Sharpton was being brought up on 67 counts of something. I mean, it was just like, it was ridiculous. Nobody, I mean, the press put this thing together everywhere. The newspaper said, this is impossible. 67 counts, he'll serve 400 years in prison. I mean, they had the whole thing. It was impossible for him to possibly be defended. You all know the story of that. This brother defended him. He walked clear of every single count. He is like Marcus Garvey in that he couldn't be controlled. So ultimately they tried to deport him out of the legal system. But we all know they cannot stop this champion. He is our own attorney, Alton Maddox.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gary. Well, since I have been invited to the Slave Theater to speak tonight, something that doesn't happen too often, I won't start out with the customary chant, no justice, no peace. As Roy and others put this program together, it became obvious to me, and I know that our speakers tonight somewhat rushed through this, but you really cannot do justice to this subject in one setting. And certainly I can't do justice within the time that is allotted to me in one setting. So I think that we have been trying to get people to come back on the 6th to really expand on this and really to finalize this. And everyone has agreed to do that. So Professor Wilson, I know you were running through a lot, but you're going to get a chance for an encore. As I was asked to come here to speak about global white supremacy, the legal effects of it, one of the things that you do in the courtroom is that you bring on your exhibits to prove your case. And so I reached out for my exhibit. Exhibit A was in Washington, D.C., and Exhibit B was in Oklahoma. And somehow or another, Rochester had to serve Jack Bennett today, and Beulah had to do some cooking out in Oklahoma. So the legal effects of white supremacy are not here. As a matter of fact, Judge Tom was scheduled to go on the Supreme Court in November, but somebody from the porno shop called him up and said, if you wait until November to go on, you may not be able to sit on a case that's going to deal with the future of pornography. And so Clarence was sworn in today to ensure that pornography lives on. When you began to understand the white man, and you also begin to understand Clarence, one of the things you have to do is this. Clarence said at his swearing in with the president last week that his best friend was his wife. And that's important. We won't have a chance to get into that tonight. Maybe next week we talk about Satanism. this topic is sort of limited tonight to something else. But in saying that, I think that we did not focus on the right person. These hearings should not have been about Clarence. They should have been about Clarence's wife and what she is into. I said a couple weeks ago, before these hearings got started, that this hearing was about homosexuality and lesbianism. And I just only add to that the hearing was really about homosexuality, lesbianism, and Satanism. And when you begin to understand that she was a member of this organization called CAN, Cult Awareness Network, misleading term, as all whitey's terms are. But I would suggest between here and next week that you do a little research on CAN, and we'll get into Satanism next week. I'll stick to my topic this week. But in listening to the other speakers, what was interesting was that Professor Wilson talked about Columbus and not focusing on Columbus, but focusing on what was behind Columbus. And we have a tendency to focus on the wrong thing. And we therefore miss the point. We get a false reading of what is happening. And so when we begin to focus on the white man, what we really have to focus on is the white man's best friend. And I won't get into that this week. But I think we all know who the white man's best friend. And in understanding the white man's best friend, we can begin to understand the legal system that Whitey has put together. Because there's a relationship in that, but I will leave that to my lecture on biology. But I won't get into that tonight. I'll leave that because we deal with the legal aspects tonight. But in order to understand the legal aspect, you have to understand so many other things. You know, one of the things about really being a great lawyer is having a mastery of so many subjects. You know, and sometimes you find yourself in a medical library, sometimes you deal with psychology and so many other things. What we're going to focus in on tonight, which I think is extremely important, and the subject that I am particularly interested in now, is the whole notion of psycholinguistics. We must begin to call things by their proper name and begin to make an appropriate analysis of that. And so we have to begin to look at the legal system much differently than we have looked at it in the past. Now, when we look at the legal system, it is my opinion that there are two symbols that are important to understand the legal system. One is the scales of justice, which a lot of people don't understand. The legal system to the white man is like a boxing match. It's a contest. And the first thing the boxers have to do is get on the scales. Well, that's what happens in court. When you go in the courtroom, one of the plaintiff and the other the defendant, they said, well, Mr. Plaintiff, get on the scales. And you say, hey, wait a minute. I thought I was here for justice. But you see, that's what those scales are for, to weigh you in. And the one that is weighed as the heavyweight outweighs the lightweight in terms of economic power. And that is the reason why we are always losing, because when we go in there and they weigh us in, we are always being outweighed. You see, because when the man rules against us, you know, Whitey said, well, you know, I had to rule against you because that was a heavyweight and you a lightweight. And you ought to be glad that I ruled against you, because if I had to rule against you, you had to get in that fight with him and you would have really gotten whipped. So you ought to be thankful that I ruled in your favor so you wouldn't have to get whipped by this heavyweight. You see, it had nothing to do with what your case is about. It has something to do with the power that you bring to the courtroom as opposed to the power that your opposition bring, and the scales of justice are used to determine that. You see, I don't know what we thought these scales were for. I mean, the white man don't hide his stuff. Negroes just look at stuff and start hallucinating and imagining something else. But this cracker puts it right out there. You see the scale and he's telling you, I'm getting ready to weigh something. I mean, it's right there. I don't know why we get confused about what this man put right out there. Negroes thought about, it's justice, I just gonna do right, and I know I'm right, and I know everything gonna work out all right. You know what I mean? It ain't got nothing to do with that at all. It has nothing to do with that at all. So we have to begin to improve our vision and deal with our language. You see, we got to make sure that our eyes are operating on 2020. And in fact, they have not been. Dr. Clarke has lost his sight, but has greater vision than anybody in this room. Let us not lose sight of that. The other thing about the American legal system and legal systems in all European countries, but particularly here, is that the other great symbol of American justice and European justice, but particularly American justice, is the eagle. You see, that symbolizes his judicial system, because the eagle is a scavenger. And that's what the white man's law is. It's a scavenger. You see, government does not produce anything. And, when we look at someone who has a Rolls Royce, a Mercedes, living in a mansion, and has $6 or $7 million stashed around, people say, well, man, what do you do? And then the guy said, well, I don't do anything. I don't work. And then people say, well, man, that guy must be in the drug trade. He must be doing something illegal. Well, you see, that's the way government is. You have a city government that has a $29 billion budget and does no work. It doesn't produce anything. So if it does not produce anything, and it has $29 billion a year to operate with, then you must imagine that this government is engaged in criminal activity, because that's the only way that it could function. And so when you begin to understand this, and this is psychological, and we have to deal with this on another day, is that you must, in order to understand European institutions, you must understand the criminal mind. You must understand the criminal mind, because all of his history indicates criminality, and everything that he has acquired has been as a result of criminality. And I remember last year I have a Bill of Rights speech that I made at Columbia last year. And Roy, those have been asking me to give that here at some point in terms of dealing with the Bill of Rights. But just as a preview, which I won't have time to do tonight, is that the Constitution was written by the criminal mind. I mean, if you read this document, it becomes very clear that it is a criminal document. And you see, when it gets to the amendments, and it talks about the right to a trial by a jury of your peers, who but a criminal would write something like that in a document? All right, you see, when these bad boys sat down, and everybody said, well, man, we may be getting ourselves in a little trouble here. We're in some bad stuff. So the signer said, well, let us make sure that we have a trial by a jury of our peers. You see, if we're going to be trying, let other gangsters and other criminals sit in the jury box. You see, and when you begin to understand that the Fifth Amendment says you have the right to be quiet. Now, who but a criminal would be informing other criminals to be quiet? You see, so when you begin to study this document, I can prove to you on a criminal mind lecture that it was criminals who put this document together to protect criminals and criminality. But what I want to talk about is 3 quick points. And then I'll be through for tonight, but it has to require a lot of expansion because these are very interesting subjects. And, you know, when I went through law school, like everybody else, you were not really taught the law. And I look at about 99% of most lawyers now, and they have absolutely no idea about the law. And when they go into courtrooms, they actually go into courtroom arguing for their continued oppression because they have no idea of what they're arguing about. And, you know, the one thing in terms of my career is that I say this all the time because it's true. There was no better trial lawyer in America than me. I mean, with no question about that. But the reason why that was so was not because I was a great genius. There was nobody who studied law and legal institutions more than I did. I studied this 24 hours a day because I understood that I had been miseducated in the law and I had to work this out for myself in order for me to be effective in representing black people. Because the entire law school education was never directed toward representing black people. So when I got out and I came up with these new strategies and techniques, the white boy did not know how to deal with it because the whitey had never been taught that himself. So when I was going in a courtroom playing guerrilla warfare and military science, nobody understood what was going on. All right? But when we began to look at certain concepts, and these are very important, there is no such thing as a constitutional right. All right? And you know, most lawyers use that word, but they don't know what they're talking about. And you know you're in trouble when you get a Negro up there talking about your constitutional rights. I mean, you may well get ready to go to jail right then. All right? All right? When they start talking about your constitutional rights, Jack, you better get ready to boogie. All right? You know, because after reading everything in the law, I realized there was only one case that was relevant, and the white man has printed over millions of cases. And that one was Dred Scott. And that's the only case I ever used. And I would whip people on Dred Scott. You know, everybody will be reading 100 cases, I just get Dred Scott, you know, and go in the courtroom with Dred Scott and win on that concept because it defined us properly in the American judicial system. And that's what's important, is appropriate definitions. You see, if you misdefine yourself, you've already lost the battle. You know, just on misdefinition. So misdefinition is very key, and phrasing the right question is very key. You see, and that's another problem that we have. We never phrase the right question. We never phrase the right issue, and we always lose. I can tell you whether you're going to win or lose by the way you phrase your issues. And so all I have to do is say, what's your issue? If you phrase it wrong, you lost. Wow. And you know, that happened so many times. I've come to the slave many times, predicted things, but I predicted them scientifically because I knew that you were misdefining your issues, which is a subject into itself that we won't have time tonight to go into. But going back, it is no such thing as constitutional rights. What it is constitutional authority. You see, it's not a constitutional right, it's constitutional authority. And when you read the Constitution appropriately, then you will know that there is no constitutional right. Each provision, each amendment does not talk about the rights of the people. That's only in the preamble. You know, everybody reads the preamble and then that's it. But if you analyze the document, it does not talk about rights, it's talk about authority. For example, if you look at for example, I'm just going to read this so you can see them real quick. The Third Amendment reads like this: no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Let me read that again. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Now that does not say that you have a right not to have soldiers in your house. It says that the government has the authority to place soldiers in your house. You see, it doesn't say what you think it says. So when you say, well, I have a right, you know, just like people say, well, I have a right not to be sexually harassed. Well, that is not so in the workplace in America. You know, white people have a right, or they are given a license to harass you sexually in the workplace. And the reason why you know that they have that right is because they are saying that we got to pass a statute. Now, what that statute does is say, and this is what all statutes do, it says not that you don't have a right to sexually harass, it says that you have a right to sexually harass up to a certain point. You see? So it's never you don't have the right. So when you say, well, I'm being sexually harassed. Well, the Supreme Court has only ruled once on this, and this was a case where the guy had raped this woman repeatedly on the job, and had done a lot of other funny things. And so they said, well, that may reach the level of sexual harassment. But they only said that without Clarence on the bench. All right? Now, Clarence now is on the bench. Souter is on the bench. Thurgood is off the bench. Brennan is off the bench. And so raping a woman under the Thomas Supreme Court may be all right. You see? But in any event, sexual harassment up to a point is okay. So when you look at the white man's law, it does not say what you say it says. You know, but your interpretation of the law is really a reflection of your faith in him.
Yeah. Right.
You see, and the more faith that you have in him, the more of an inability of you to see what the law really says. You know, and you can sit down with lawyers and they will misconstruct what the statute actually says because of their underlying faith in the man himself. But if you don't know who the man is, you're going to mystify what his law actually says. Another amendment, just be very quickly. The Fourth Amendment says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, home, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. Now that doesn't say the government can't search your house. Right. And they don't define what is an unreasonable search.
Right.
You see? So that's the authority to search your house. It's not your right not to have your house searched. So you have to begin to understand the white man's way of expressing himself before we can really get a lot deeper. Now, the 13th Amendment is where he claims that he outlawed slavery. But the statute does not say that. I mean, the Constitution doesn't say that. What the Constitution says is this. It says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. But in the small print it says, this provision is not necessarily enforceable. You see? So, because the next line says, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. It didn't say that Congress must create legislation. It said that Congress can create legislation. And the power that Congress has in creating legislation, Congress turn right around and repeal that legislation. You see, so there is no constitutional amendment in this country that bars slavery. So at any moment now, we will all be heading back to the plantation. All right, so, I don't want nobody to sit up here and say, well, man, I know we done got past that hurdle. Because you have not. Whitey has been waiting down the road for you because there is no constitutional provision that outlaws slavery. Because in order to outlaw slavery, it depends upon what Congress thinks at any given moment. And you know what that's about. So that's your legal status in America. We have to be very clear about this and how the law is and how we must read it. Now, going back to the 7th Amendment, since they said that slavery shall not be had in this country, going back to the 7th Amendment, let's check this out. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel or unusual punishment inflicted. Now what that means is A, that you can be subject to a bond, B, that you can be subject to fines, and C, that you can be subject to punishment. Okay? It does not bar anything. It gives the white man the authority to place you in slavery before you have ever been convicted, which is in violation if you believe in the white man in the 13th Amendment, which says that involuntary servitude is prohibited. Because going back to the 7th Amendment, to be on bond means that you're in slavery. Because bond is a derivative of bondage. The term bond means that you are a slave of the state. So anytime that you're merely charged with a crime and they put you on a bond, then you have become a slave of the state. And so therefore, if the 13th Amendment meant that slavery was prohibited, you couldn't be subject to a bond before you were convicted, which would fly in the face of what the white man's language says. So these are the kinds of things that we have to be very clear about as a people in understanding, A, the language that he uses. You see, beyond everything else, the language that he uses. We can talk about all this other stuff later. But if we don't begin to deal with his language, which in effect, in my opinion, and I'm not a psychologist, and Dr. Wilson, I'm sort of a jackleg, of these things. But, I begin to believe that the more that we use the oppressor's language, the more that we become like the oppressor. I believe there's some psychological effect to that, you see? And I believe that as these Negroes talk about, I got to speak properly, and that I'm articulate, I think that that begins to change the mental framework of that individual. And I think that we have to be very clear about this whole notion of language that we have not really gotten into deeply enough as we should. But we cannot free ourselves until we begin to understand the oppressor's language and understand the psychological effects that that language itself has on us as a people and our own independent ability to reason and to think and to solve problems. Now, I'm going to run through these other things real quick and then we'll do it the next time. When we talk about the government as a scavenger, let us understand that the government does not produce anything, and that becomes very important. And the government operates by taking from you And there is a redistribution of wealth. Okay? Because every June, you have worked for the first 5 months for the government. All right? Now, Oliver Wendell Holmes said this. I didn't say this. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a American Supreme Court jurist. Oliver Wendell Holmes says that the police powers of the government amounted to larceny. Okay, in effect, what Holmes was saying is that every action on behalf of the government is a criminal action. And if you are properly reading whatever the government does, the government has a license to commit crimes. And the only thing that you need is a penal code to go down the list of the kinds of crimes that they have committed. For example, most people in here, if they had their own free choice and was not forced to, would not pay taxes. All right? But we are subject to the same routine that organized crime subject on store owners. We have to pay up a price for doing business. That's called extortion. All right? So we are all victims of extortion. You know? Now, you know, a lot of times you go to a person's house, they say, man, the government just came out here and took all my property. And I said, they came out here and just took your property? Yeah, they took my property. Why? Well, because they said I owe something. I said, well, when they came out here, how many of them was it? They said, well, about 10 of them. I said, well, they big guys or what? They said, yeah, they were big strappy dudes. Did they have guns on them? Yeah, they had guns on them. Did they tell you to shut up and get over in the corner? I said, brother, you was not the subject of a taking. You was robbed. All right? You see, we have to begin to use the language. You know, it wasn't just that the government took stuff from you. The government came out here and committed armed robbery. All right? That's what that is about. You see, when you have to pay all of these penalties, that's usury. You know, the government said, well, you got to pay everything. You know what I mean? That's usury. That's a license of the government to commit all of these criminal actions because it is an extension of the law itself. And so, finally, my last point for the night is this, and we have to be very clear about this. We have never, and we got to stop using, we have never had a civil rights movement in America. All right? All right, let's be very clear. We have never had a civil rights movement in America. The right to park your behind next to a white behind was not civil rights. All right? The right to share the ability to stink up an outhouse with a cracker was not civil rights. I mean, it wasn't. All right? And we got to be very clear about it. You know, everybody talking the civil rights movement. Where? When did it happen? Who led the civil rights movement? All right? Because there is nothing in the Constitution that's legitimate that talks about civil rights. That's legitimate. Now, there are some illegitimate clauses in the Constitution, but there is nothing in the Constitution that deals with civil rights. What the Constitution deals with, and what we have to be clear about, the Constitution and American life talks about producers and consumers. And our problem in America is that we are consumers and the law prevents us from becoming producers. That's our problem in America. And the reason why the American courts were prepared to allow us eventually to sit at a lunch counter next to a white person was to expand our consumer rights. The ability to buy a sandwich at a lunch counter, which had nothing to do with our civil rights. You see, but if we keep confusing this, we're going to be off point because America will never give us civil rights. All right? It was never intended because the original Constitution, which talks about 3/5 of a man, was never repealed. That's still in the Constitution. They didn't take that out. You know, generally when they write a new Constitution provision, they take out the old one. They didn't take that bad boy out. All right? Because they meant that to exist. So there's no such thing. So if you want to know what the struggle is with Clarence Thomas. The struggle is that Clarence believes in construing the Constitution according to the original framers of the Constitution. Okay, that's Clarence's position is that in order to understand the Constitution, you cannot expand the Constitution beyond what the original signers intend that to be. So when Negro talk about, well, let's give Clarence a chance. To do what? Negro give everybody a chance. It's amazing, of us giving somebody a chance. I was listening to a radio station about a couple weeks ago, not yours, one Friday when you were not on. And I got absolutely berserk. It's hard for me to listen to talk radio, Gary. Because some people call up as nuts. I believe that they allow somebody to get out of Bellevue or somewhere, the nut house, and make these calls because we don't listen to what we say. And this is very important. Person called up and said, why don't we give Dave a chance? And then it became a rap song. Everybody started calling and saying, why don't we give Dave a chance? And I said, hey, what's going on here? A Negro go nuts. Give him a chance to do what? What are we giving him a chance to do? All right, and then beyond that, what really bothered me was we are giving him a chance. All right, people call up and say, well, I'm tired of people calling up criticizing the mayor. Well, I got a right to call up and criticize the mayor. All right, but we are giving him a chance because if we stop giving him a chance, we will put up a recall petition. You see, not giving somebody a chance is being punitive. You got a right to give somebody a chance and then criticize what they do. We got to learn the difference between criticism and punitive action. When you Negroes get confused, so when you call them to criticize somebody, then they take it as you're taking punitive action. You are not. Criticism does not mean punitive action. Let's understand the difference. If we decided to be punitive, we would put a recall petition up, have so many people to sign it, and kick him out of office after 2 years. It ain't like we don't know what to do. So when somebody called us and said, well, let's give him a chance, we are giving him a chance. I know how to go down there tonight and put a recall petition together. So we got to be very clear about that. And just going back to this whole thing about producers and consumers, because that's a whole different topic in itself. And you see what that brings in is this. When Congress got ready to enact the civil rights statutes, in order for you to sit at a lunch counter next to a white person to get jungle fever, because right after 1965, all this stuff was playing, because right after 65, then they brought this case in, Loving versus Virginia. And that said that Negroes could marry white folks. All right, and that's what the creation of jungle fever, because the white man knew down the line that he was going to need his white women to keep y'all in check. Since y'all think that she's a minority along with y'all, and that y'all got something in common. All right, this is the brainwashing Whitey is into, and you are buying into this. So you can't get a Negro leader to start talking if I first talk about women's rights. All right, that becomes the beginning. But understand now, when the Civil Rights Statute was created in the 64 and 65, it was the Commerce Clause that Congress relied on. All right, not civil rights. The Commerce Clause. So even Congress understood that it was the Commerce Clause and not the Civil Rights Clauses that would allow you to sit at a lunch counter next to a white person. Now, it is my contention that the most important aspect of law, and there are all kinds of different subjects, but the most important subject in the law is not constitutional law. It's not criminal law. It's not family law, so to speak. But the most important law is antitrust law. You see, because in antitrust law, you deal with the whole notion of producers and consumers and who can become producers. How economic markets are allocated. You see, that is part of antitrust law. That's what we're talking about, market power. That's the reason why when y'all went over to Church Avenue and started boycotting, the powers that be understood that you were disrupting the market. You understand? You were disrupting the market. So in order to really have an impact on America, you got to disrupt the market. You got to know what the market is, and then you got to disrupt the market. Because that is what America is about. And you was beginning to upset the apple cart. And you see, you don't have to upset the entire market. The only thing you have to do is upset the profit margin. You see, you don't have to disrupt it all. Just make sure that they do not make a profit. And then you'll begin to succeed. So they said, no, we got to stop this. We can't let them, because they are the most important consumers in America, because they don't demand anything. You see, so our dollar is worth more than any other dollar. That's why everybody rather have our dollar than any other dollar, because there are no strings attached to our dollars. You see, it's a free dollar, and that's why it's very important. But going back to understand this, why was Bork nominated as a Supreme Court Justice? And, you know, everybody said, well, yeah, Bork was out to get black people. He was. But Bork is not considered a constitutional scholar. Bork is considered an antitrust scholar. You see, and what Bush is doing is using scientific means to destabilize us as consumers. You see, by dealing with antitrust, we look over at constitutional law. You know, we look over at civil rights. And White is doing a reaction on us with something else, which is what always happens. You know what I mean? They have us looking left and they coming right. All right? You know what I mean? That is something that always happens, because we must begin to understand this structure. You see, because you cannot combat this structure. And that's the reason why, you know, we said that we had to do more than one night here, because we got to reorient ourselves. We got to come up with a new terminology and a new definition and a new vision and an ability to create the right issues. You know, during the mayoral race, for example, everybody said we got to have a black mayor. Well, that became the issue. And everybody worked on that issue. And while you were saying we had to have a black mayor, I said, the man that you get ready to elect is going to be caught in blackface. Now, I wasn't a genius. And I think most people realize that that's what we have, caught in blackface. But I wasn't a genius, you see, in coming to that conclusion. Why was I able to come to that conclusion? Because I heard the way you framed the issue. You see, what you did was this. You said we got to have a black mayor. Okay? Then I knew that in political parties, the most important thing is not a personality. The most important thing is a platform. Right. So if you are focusing on a black mayor, and the white power structure said, well, yeah, we know we might be able to live with that because they don't have a platform to go along with it. You know, let's continue the platform that we had. Mm-hmm. All right, which is Koch's platform. Right. So therefore, when you put two and two together, you have Koch's platform plus a black face. So you have Koch in blackface. You see, it doesn't take a genius to do that. It's just a matter of analysis. You see, we do not gather information and then analyze information. And we always develop a label that everybody starts chanting to. You know, run, they run, run, they run, run, they run, run, they run. And nobody has made an analysis of what this is about. You see, and so we're always, you know, failing. I've said now, I told Mr. Brown that I won't discuss the conversation, but I said, you know, I'm going to start keeping quiet. I'm going to tell you why, because you see, everybody looks at me as a nut. Now I'm serious, you know, every time I come out with something, everybody says, man, that guy's crazy. You know what I mean? I mean, you better leave it alone, because you know what happens is that when you predict something, and what we must start doing, so we got to start forecasting. See, I believe in forecasting. I believe in projecting ahead. So when you started forecasting, you become like Noah and the ark. You know, and Noah running around there building a ship. And everybody said, that clown is crazy. All right, and everybody kept booking because Noah was forecasting and everybody else was living in the present. You see, and bragging about the past. But we got to begin to project above that, and part of this whole thing about white global supremacy or global white supremacy is the gathering of information. You see, and that's a whole different topic. You see, and the ability to analyze that information. But those are things that we're going to get into. See, I'm not going to make any more predictions. All right, I got a lot more predictions I can make. But I'm not going to make any more predictions, but I'm going to begin to give you the tools for you to make the predictions yourself. Thank you very much.
Brother Alternatics, brothers and sisters. Let's give it up. Alternatics. Yes. Our program continues. We have an announcement that is going to come up right now before our panelists get the opportunity of responding to questions from those of you who are here who have questions or comments that you'd like to share with them. We will have a couple of announcements in this case.
It is my position that what really frightened America about Ali is that Ali, for one of the few times, especially in our lifetime, said that he was prepared to recognize the true separation of church and state, and not in some type of false sense, and that therefore, recognizing a separation between church and state, that he was prepared to give honor to his teacher, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And what that did in American life was, for one of the few times, it brought down the white man as the obedient person that blacks have to obey. You know, it's like going back to the plantation, and the white man comes down to the field and says, John, I want you to do this. And then John turned around and said, well, I better ask Henry. And the boss said, ask Henry. I mean, you know, I told you this is what you do. And the reason why that becomes important is that it is my contention that the problem with our religious institutions is that Reverend Hoopenholler is a pagan. All right? And that what we have in our community are devil worshippers. All right? Because if you adorn a white Jesus on your wall, and if you bow down to the white man, then you got to be a devil worshiper. Because when Elijah Muhammad said that the white man was a devil, you know, most black people say, well, you know, Elijah is crazy. All right? You know, I mean, you know, you can't say that. And what is important is that if you are around Negroes and you say, you know, Reverend Hoopenholler, the white man is a devil, you know, he'll say, well, you better shut your mouth. Yeah. But then Reverend Hoopenholler will turn around and use God's name in vain. You know, so you got a situation where we are giving respect to the white man by saying, don't call him a devil. But when you use the God name in vain, like, you know, the God, the whatever, you know, then it's all right. So what I'm saying is that until we get to the point, the reason why religion has failed is because we do not acknowledge, as Ali did, that I'm not following a white government, I'm not following a white man, I'm not worshiping a white man or a white government, I'm worshiping somebody that looks like myself. You see, and that's the reason why we don't have black leadership. Because if we had black leadership, then we would follow somebody. You see, but we will not follow somebody. So if the white man steps in and say, I want 50,000 y'all to go to war, we're going to war. I don't care what our religious practices may have been. You see, so that's not anything but worshiping the devil. You know, and so when you say that, can we develop institutions in this society?
Those of us who say that we are ready, is it appropriate for us to put down roots, to buy buildings, to have property, that kind of thing?
Okay, well, I'm going to get to that. When we say that we are building institutions, first of all, psychologically, we have to be prepared to only obey each other. All right, that's the first thing. In terms of the real psychological development, so when you say someone's conscious can only mean that I will not follow the devil. All right, that's what consciousness means. You know, I'm only going to follow a black man or a black woman. You know, that's period. Now, once you develop that, all right, that then begins the only way where you can begin to attempt to build institutions in this society. But I think, as Dr. Wilson pointed out, that the white man will die first before he relinquishes white supremacy. So there's going to have to ultimately be a confrontation. But I think that in terms of our own development, once we understand how to build institutions, then we can build them somewhere else as well as building them here. So learning how to build institutions is not necessarily something that will become lost. You see, even if you had to go somewhere else, but the nature of American society is such that the structure of this society is already in place, and that there is nothing in this society going to allow us to coexist with him on an equitable basis. But I think the main point, though, is one about Ali, and that is to recognize that what made Ali great is because this was one of the few black men who said, I'm going to follow another black man. Elijah Muhammad told me not to go to war. And see, that's what really shook up white America. The idea that you will find a black man who will say, I'm only going to follow another black man. The black man give me an order to do something, I will do it. And until we can develop that kind of consciousness, then we're not going to even have the framework in which to begin to even attempt to build these institutions.
We're live. We're saying to right for our stage. Just one second, just lock the microphone going.
The answer for that, with all I'm going to add is that people rise and fall within the context of institutions. But if you have an institution that's black, has no black values, then you have no institution.
Let's just pull the mic a little closer to Dr. Clarke.
No, I was just calling attention to the fact that if you have an institution that's black and you have no black values, then you have no institution. Then your institution becomes part of the instrument of your own oppression. When an institution be of any value to you, then your values must govern that institution. This is why our predominantly black colleges are losing their value, because they don't even teach honestly about black people. They have no black values, no black curricula, and just white people and black face.
We're going to our stage like microphone.
Hello to the brothers and sisters, hello to the honored guests. I have two questions, one for Dr. Clarke and one for Attorney Alton Maddox. To Dr. Clarke, I began to discuss how their religion was built on cultures from the Nile Valley. And I began to explain to them, as I learned from the African professors such as yourself, I began explaining to them how the mythology for their belief was based on cultures that came thousands of years before Abraham was even born, the first Hebrew. And it seems that in desperation, they had to come up with something, because they were stumbled, they had to come up with something, and they said, well, where do you get these states from? The stating system was probably made by a white man, and being that the stating system was made by a white man, how can African scholars stand on it? And I said, well, I happen to believe that they have researched themselves, so I stand on it. But as far as knowing about how they go about things, I didn't know. So my question is, What's that thing? What is that dating system? How
Dating system?
Yes, as far as Egyptian artifacts are concerned, as far as Hebrew,
But that was already done. Look, most religious arguments are a waste of time because your listener made up his mind what he's going to believe no matter what you say. And we stop engaging in, and sometimes you sit on a whole lot of documents that I'm going to read them. And sometimes if you mention white documents, the blacks are going to say that it's white thing. Some of those brilliant work ever done on the argument of religion been done by whites. And some brilliant work been done by blacks also. They're not going to read John Jackson's Christianity Before Christ and Dr. Ben's African Origins of the Major Western Religions. And there are two books written by a white scholar, among his book, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, Who is This King of Glory? Probably the best book ever written on the Christ story. A Shadow of the 30th Century. Another book on the development of Christianity, and his book on the lost Christianity. I mean, a whole lot of people want to argue. Really, they don't want to read, they don't want to do research, and they want to watch their ego at your expense. You have to understand, when you're in these kind of catch-22 arguments, the best way out of it is to put your right foot in front of your left foot in front of your
very much. Walter Matt, as far as Clarence Thomas, what organization was his wife involved in? You just left us hanging on that.
No, well, the name of the organization was Cult Awareness Network. The acronym is CAN, and it is an organization that should be studied. One, in terms of its own practices, and then, as an aside, I would say this. I think that when you go back to Tawana Brown, that you're going to find that those persons that were involved in her kidnapping and abduction, that the practice of Satanism was very much practiced up in that area, up in Dutchess County and around that area. And so what we're dealing with some cults that are out here, and we're dealing with white people who have some strange worshiping practices. And I think that there are people out here who certainly did not bring to bear that she was a member of such a cult, and that cult was engaged in some satanic practices that should be examined. It's very interesting that nobody really dwelled in her background as we were dealing with Clarence Thomas. And a lot of times, what we have to begin to do is this. I say this so often, but it becomes very key. Whoever is in front of the camera, don't ever look at that person for your answers. Always look at the person next to that person. That is the person who will determine who that person is before the camera. So if you really want to know who Clarence Thomas is, you really have to know who his wife is. And as I said before, some of the things that Anita Hill was saying probably did take place. Now the question whether she was consenting to that or not is what has to be debated. But as far as the conversation is concerned, there's no question that Clarence does have some funny practices that he's engaged in, and that next week, I believe that if Reverend Bevel talks about what he has told me, you will also find out that George Bush is engaged in some funny practices. And that might really give us some enlightenment as to the real relationship between Bush and Clarence Thomas. And I will only say that in looking at our black leadership in the future, let us not discount the fact that our black leadership is possibly going to be made up of homosexuals and lesbians. All right? And that why that is important to the white man is that he can control our leaders through sex.
Right.
You see, and whisper and consult with our leaders in the bedroom and send those leaders back into our community. So you're going to see jungle fever in all kinds of directions. All right? I think that we really need to be very much aware of our leadership, and even as we look at some of our leaders now, there's no question that many of them are sleeping with white. Some of them are sleeping with whites of the same sex.
Exactly.
We're live. Let's thank you to move to our stage right microphone for a question or comment. Thank you.
Yes, my question is for Alan now. Is it correct to infer from your analysis that Africans in America are not citizens of the United States?
Yes, it is absolutely clear that there is nothing that you can point to that has made us citizens in fact in this country, and that you know, one of the things, and I think that, you know, Dr. Clarke and others probably can really examine this, is the fact that when we walked off of that plantation, so to speak, that became a very critical moment. Because if we became citizens of this country, that was another act of white supremacy. Because why would people who've been kidnapped from their land then be automatically hijacked into the Constitution if that's not white supremacy? I mean, if you've been kidnapped, and they're going to settle the score, they will allow you to go back to your family and to your land. But to tell you that you're going to be included into the Constitution means that you have been forced against your will to carry on a citizenship that is not appropriate. And what is very interesting here is that when we talk about the Reconstruction period, it is my belief that what happened between 1875, so to speak, and around 1930 was not as bad as what happened after 1930. Because I believe that when we look at that period after 1875, although we were for a moment given certain political opportunities, so to speak, what was significant about that period in my review of history is that we were allowed to reconstruct our families. All right, and so it was, and when we look at the Reconstruction period, we said, well, boy, you know, we lost a lot. We didn't lose a lot because we were bringing our families back together. That wasn't losing. You see, the white man got us so addicted to, you know, his political system, and the fact that one minute we were supposed to be U.S. senators, and then the next minute we were not. And then we gauged our values on, well, now we lost. We didn't lose because we were bringing back our families. Because the whole sharecropping system meant that families had to come together. That was the whole notion of family. When you look back at that period, you see families together. That was the reason why when a Marcus Garvey could come here, he could come here already having a family structure intact. Something that Garvey couldn't do today. Because the family structure today is not intact. So when we look at the worst period in our history was the period of FDR. And the period before that was Woodrow Wilson, because they were setting the stage for the raw deal. It wasn't the New Deal, it was the raw deal. So when you look at what they began to do during the period of raw deal was to destroy the black family. The family that had for the last 50 or so years were able to reconstruct itself. But then they came up with this raw deal legislation, you know, taking a tool out of our hand and putting a welfare check in our hand, which turned us from producers into consumers. You see, and as a consumer group, we are now victims and are vulnerable to all of their activities because we no longer existed as producers. So we really have to look at that period as the raw deal legislation. And then we have to look at the period of Lyndon Johnson, in my estimation, as a period when, under the guise of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, that act was designed to destroy black leadership. Because what it did was it took away people like Malcolm and Martin and others and gave us some political puppets who are members of the Dixiecrat Party, which is the original slave party. You know, I mean, so we have now run right back in the slave master's hands. You see, after so many years, because we're back in the Dixiecrat Party under his control, and therefore we are looking upon so-called black leaders as politicians, and they are already wedded to their own masters, because the one thing the white people do that we don't do is that they make you take an oath. You see, and your oath is that you have to obey them. So any man that takes a white man's oath, by definition, cannot be your leader, because he's already has sworn allegiance to your enemy. You see, but you pick those same people and say, well, they're our leaders, but they sworn their allegiance to your enemy. And so your enemy's puppets are leading you. And that's a Judas goat leading you to slaughter.
This is for the historians. I met Dr. Leonard Jeffries up in Harlem during the summer, right? And I asked him, how come nobody had the guts to get up and tell those Jews right in their face that it was a Jew by the name of Adolf Hitler, which is Adolf Hitler that started the Holocaust, right? You got to get these bastards' face and tell them where it's coming from, all right? And what happened?
No, don't point the mic, just talking to America.
What happened is, nobody had the guts to tell these people that it was a Jew by the name of Adolf Hitler, as you know, Adolf Hitler, the Nazis, that started the Holocaust. He was a half-caste Jew. He was an Austrian. Either his mother or his father was a Jew, and he was the one that started the Holocaust. So don't blame Dr. Jeffries, or don't blame me, because it's one of yours that started killing yours. You know what I mean?
It's a Dr. Clarke relationship to the Holocaust. There is this role that happens inside and a number of activities that really distort it at this point in terms of, I guess, Jewish presentation of it. What are the things that we should know about the Holocaust?
First place, we should stop letting the Jews have a monopoly on the word Holocaust. The Belgians in the Congo killed at least 30 million people. Every major Holocaust against African people, the Jews of Europe participated in that Holocaust, colonialism and slavery, as Europeans, first and foremost. We should call it the European Holocaust or the German Holocaust. European racism has spent itself out outside of Europe. In Europe, it turned inward on itself. That created the German Holocaust. Some deals were tried. They tried to make certain deals, and they were going to buy certain portions of the deals. There was an internal fight between white people and white people. The Jewish problem was started in Europe by Europeans, should be solved in Europe by Europeans. Europeans are genius, draining the diseased pulse of their political sores on the lands of other people, draining other people's land in order to recoup fortunes that they spoiled themselves. This is one of the dimensions of global white supremacy that we did not discuss tonight, but sooner or later we're going to have to take the economics of it into consideration. I agree with Professor Wilson. We do need another whack at it, and when I can read my books, I'll see that date is open. I'll be back here because I was going to focus on slave and colonialism as global white supremacy.
Dr. Clarke, I'm sorry, Dr. Clarke, if you could, there's something that you mentioned to me that's probably around 1986 and had a very profound effect on how I perceive history. You talked about how some chapters of history
we have to stop trying to find a good guy or a bad guy. Sometimes there are no heroes and
You know, sometimes because of Hollywood's appeal, if you're looking for heroes, some parts of history have no heroes, it's all villains. And sometimes also we have to stop looking for a charismatic leader. We have to look for a charismatic program. Right.
Recently, my name is Brother Abdul Hassan, and I have 2 comments and a question. The first comment is everyone or our brothers and sisters aware of the latest campaign being waged by the white man, the fact that he's trying to convince all the sisters to go unto him? Example, you look at the drive of the news station, you see always a white man and a black woman interacting. In magazines, you see white men and black women holding hands. Okay, that's one comment. The next comment is, divine chastisement is in effect. What I mean by that is, do you notice how the white area in Oakland and Berkeley, California looks a lot like Iraq after the desert slaughter? Okay, and my question is to Professor Wilson. You mentioned that it's going to take force to remove the white man from his position. Is there a place for the brothers to train? And if there isn't, is there a place being talked about? Or is it in the works? Because there's a lot of brothers that are ready to take a stand and they just have nowhere to go.
Thank you. Certainly there's a place, and my first announcement when I walked up to the podium was to publicly, not so publicly, indicate that a place is being prepared for that. The Pan-African Research and Development Foundation is very much concerned. In fact, we've already been doing very intense discussions of military strategy, geopolitical strategy, and so forth. Of course, I won't talk about it all here. But this aspect, military strategy, economic strategy, because a good deal of the warfare in the future is really going to be economic in nature, is going to be very subtle. It's going to be more psychological and psychobiological in terms of germ warfare, the use of bacteria and other methods and approaches, and mainly it will be just the economic control, the way in terms of what you're seeing happening in the Soviet Union, which was ultimately defeated in terms of a prolonged economic struggle between the United States and that group of unions here. We listened carefully. The United States had indicated years ago that it would literally spin the Russians into the ground. And a good deal of the so-called arms race was not about the idea that the Russians were truly ahead of the United States or in direct competition with it militarily, but in projecting the image that it was ahead or near parity with the United States. They were able, of course, to motivate the American public to fund the military-industrial complex and to distort the Russian economy in such a way that ultimately it collapsed. And therefore, we as Africans must prepare ourselves to fight a battle, not only economically, not only militarily, but really a more of an intellectual and organizational kind of battle, and an economic sort of battle. And it is for this that, again, I urge the training, particularly of our males, so that we can undertake this kind of thing. Often we hear people talking about going back to Africa, and that's fine. But I also lay out the challenge, why don't we take over America? Why don't we proceed? You see, when you look at the psychology of males, you know, we can talk about the organizational genius of Europeans. That's a part of it. But one friend told me one day, after you get to talking about the organizational so-called powers of the European or the Japanese, whoever else you want to talk about, look at the fact that in the end they just came and took this land from people. And that the foundation of America is not its organizational genius, but the fact that they made a takeover. And when you look at what we call manhood training, in societies and groups where, let us say, what we would call cattle rustling in this country are necessary to a society that depends on cattle, the males are trained to rustle cattle and to take it from outsiders. Now, we have some oral issues, which is one of the problems we have there. But to a great extent, men must be trained to do what men must do in order to survive. If we look at the demographic orientations of this country, there's no reason why we cannot see, or at least explore the possibility of taking it over. I'd like to speak quickly to one issue raised earlier about organizations. One of the reasons why we've had some problem with organizations, of course, is because of the European move against organizations. And to a good extent, it has conditioned too many of our people away from developing organizations because of the fear of the punitive response that would result from those organizations being developed. But despite that, they have to be developed. The other thing is, of course, the absence of the training of our people in organizational technique. We often think that it is enough that our people somehow happen to be what we need to be in order for us to exist and function as a people. No culture operates on that basis. No child is born ready for its culture. People must be trained to undertake their cultural tasks and roles. We cannot expect then a development of the correct organizations and powerful organizations and social relations and so forth unless our children are actually trained to do so. A major part of the male initiation rite was the training of the male not into chauvinism, but the training of the male in how to carry on organization, to operate within organization, and as you imply, to operate within an organizational structure and a structure of authority. A major part of the initiation rite of the male was to remove that male young boy's loyalty to mother and to the herd, and to transfer those loyalties to other males and to the hierarchical structure of authorities of other males. To bring then this new young male under the thrust and the direction of the older males so that they can continue the life of the group. At this point then we have to reestablish these kinds of training centers. And we have to restructure the actual training of our young men and women. We must also develop the idea of a nation within a nation.
Right.
We cannot correctly develop institutions, educational, military, or otherwise, until we develop the concept of nation. That we are a separate nation in this country, and we must function as a separate nation in this country. Once we recognize that we are a nation within a nation, we do not have to ask anyone's permission about citizenship. The Europeans did not ask the Indians' permission to be a citizen. And consequently, when we recognize our peoplehood, we will not have to get the permission of anyone to be citizens or to be anything we desire.
Alright, let's keep moving down the way. We got more people who are questions or comments or guests, and we can go to my left. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. My name is Henrik Clarke, and pertaining to Professor Clarke, I would like to know how did the white race begin, the origin, and pertaining to Professor Wilson. There's a lot of black homosexuals, and what is their role in our ongoing growth and development of the black movement, and can they be saved as far as psychological wise? I'm only saying this because I'm new with this. I'm new at coming around, and I have a lot of questions. I'm not big, but I have a lot of questions, and I'm scared standing up here asking this question. But I'm grateful that you're giving me something to give me that is backbone for me. I'm so grateful that I'm here to hear this information and education that I need for me as well as my family. That's the question.
Thank you.
My answer
Panel discussions that we had on the effects of global white supremacy. And a person asked what, at first glance, seemed like a rational question, but after you thought about it, the question was totally irrational. They said, "Oh, you did 2 of those already, right?" I said, "Yes." "Oh, why do you have to do a 3rd one?" 300 years of global white supremacy. Why are we doing a 3rd one? Because it's still happening. It's real simple. It's still happening. But the beauty of what has happened in relationship to where we are right now is that we are moving into a new horizon. And many brothers and sisters are part of that experience as you are here. It is another level of awakening, a new consciousness that is happening. And we're very pleased at this particular point because this doesn't appear to be a fad. This is not something that's going to be here for a minute. And they're going to shuttle Superfly in and John Shaft and kind of do a number on it. This is not going to be like the end of the 60s going into the 70s. It's not going to be that. And it's a real simple premise that we operate from in relationship to this particular discussion and to our understanding of it. It's that we too have a Holocaust, and millions strong were killed and lost. And they didn't come by invitation. They were brought here to build the nation. You see, we slaved and we worked this land. I'm talking about the African, the ones their ships went out to raid, the ones Uncle Sam never paid. Now, we the children of the son of a new generation under the gun. We watch today on TV news as groups of angry Hasidic Jews storm into a police station, suffer no kind of retaliation, put a single black man in that situation, and he be dead by assassination. No justice, no peace. We understand. And what we have at this particular point is a mission. This is the 3rd in this particular series. And certainly it's something that the slave is about every day, something that we're about every day. But more and more it is becoming more clear to me that radio or presentations of this sort really are not of any real and significant benefit unless we all understand that we have an obligation to pass this information on to brothers and sisters who are not listening to the radio and who are not here at the slave theater tonight. That's your responsibility. So you aren't here tonight on an entertainment trip or on an entertainment trip for that matter. You are here to record this information and then to become mini transmitters of this information. So that when you go back home, you've got to figure out how to put this information on the dinner table at night. You've got to figure out how to take it back into your church. You've got to figure out how to take it back to your job. You've got to figure out how to spread this information around until there are no black people who are still asleep in New York City. That is your responsibility. We celebrated Dr. Martin Luther King this week, and Dr. King has one particular speech which is an exceptional one as well, and it's called Sleeping Through a Revolution. Some of you may have heard that speech. And we got some folks who are sleeping through the revolution. You got to be real clear. And the frightening part about it is we live with some of them. Some of them are our best friends. There is nothing more amazing than what happens if you begin to expose yourself to information and to consciousness over a period of time, and then you meet someone, a friend of yours, who has not been exposed to the same information over a number of years, and they are still back where you were 5, 10 years ago with no awareness of what is going down. Now, it's one thing to kind of like go, you don't know about Kemet? Oh, wow. You don't know about subliminal seduction, you know. But it's a whole other recognition that you and I have a responsibility to educate those brothers and sisters, to bring them up to snuff. We've said before that in the information age, what you don't know can kill you. These are our loved ones who don't know. These are our friends. These are our family. These are our extended family. These are our people. So I'm charging you tonight. I'm charging you each and every day from this point forward into this new year of 1992 and the rest of this decade of the 90s to take on the responsibility of not just getting the information, which you already have done and you already are doing, but take the responsibility of spreading the information. Become a missionary, but with a real mission, not the one that got us in this situation in the first place. And you all know what that was about. It was said very well. Bishop Tutu made the statement. He said, you know, when the missionaries came, he said, they had the book and we had the land. They said, we looked up a few years later, they had the land and we had the book. We want to turn that whole scenario around. And that's what the effects of global white supremacy have done to us. And so this particular experience tonight is one which has a mission to raise your consciousness, but to raise your consciousness so that you not only become warriors, but you go out and create warriors and create a great nation for us to overcome white supremacy, and it can be done. Let us welcome our brothers who participate in this panel, who've taken our consciousness up each week, and each time that we've done this step by step. We will start first of all with an honored elder. He is someone who I marvel at all the time, and even more so somehow in the last 6 or 8 months. I don't know what he is doing. I do not know what he has done in terms of diet. I don't know if I take Chinese herbs, I take everything, right, to keep my energy working and moving. I don't know what he is doing. I don't know if it's meditation and whatever else, but something has been happening that is on top of the level of genius that he normally operates on, normally anyway. He is moving on another plane of consciousness, and you are honored to be in his presence tonight. I'm speaking, of course, of Dr. John Henrik Clarke. And that's not just my opinion. Attorney Maddox and I were like talking off the side of the stage, and I said, have you noticed what's happening with Dr. He said, yeah. Oh, it's on to another wavelength. And for those of you who do not have the book, African World Revolutions, get the book. Do not let tomorrow pass without getting the book, because the kind of consciousness that we're talking about is there in that book. I mean, you will certainly experience it tonight, but get it and study it, because when we talk about this issue of overthrowing global white supremacy, Dr. John Henrik Clarke has laid very much the blueprint in that publication, African World Revolutions. Our next brother is someone who's been dealing on the level of the mind. And it's interesting because the reality is, when we talk about global white supremacy, if you go for that, it's a mental trip. You know, one of my children was upset about something that happened on Donahue the other day, because there was a brother, quote unquote, every brother ain't a brother. And the brother came on TV saying, well, I'm not into that African thing, I'm an American. Right? Okay? And he proceeded to talk about what made him an American. Now you gotta understand, clearly we know he was not born with a red, white, and blue heart. We know that. We're clear about that now, right? His blood did not come that color. But the fact of the matter is, he had looked at what America seemed to stand for, and he was saying to the world, I embrace that. I accept that. That's me. If you saw Roots last night, I've seen it 100 times. And every time I see it, there's something a little new on this issue of the mind. When I saw Fiddler last night, after he didn't understand why Kunta Kinte would take all those lashes rather than say his name was Toby. And when Fiddler finally got the reality of what was happening and said to him, brother, he said, it don't matter. It don't matter what they think your name is. Your name is Kunta Kinte. And that was a slave whose mind was freed. You see, now he was still on the plantation. He had never left the plantation, but he was free in that moment through the efforts of an African who stood tall in his African heritage. So it starts here in the mind. Freedom, the Latin, free your mind and you know what will follow. I don't have to tell you that. That's a P-Funk vibe, so you understand that. Okay. This next brother has dedicated himself to the issue of us beginning to understand the way in which our minds have been manipulated. But at the same time, and perhaps more importantly than just what they call pathology, he's also dealing with how we free ourselves from the pathology. May we welcome Dr. Amos Wilson to the stage. I like what Dr. Wilson said today inside the GBE. He said, we're going to talk tonight about global white supremacy, but we're going to talk about how to defeat global white supremacy. And we're all for that. No question. Okay, so now, you got this thing happening now where the world powers are all trying to come together. Right. Especially the European powers. Right? Europe, 1992. Fall of Soviet Union. You know, you're seeing all of the European powers, they're scrambling, trying to get together because they're afraid of the Asian menace that's coming right on them right now. And I'm talking about they're scared to death. They'll do anything rather than see what can happen if Japan and China decide to hook up as one in some economic concept. They are not idiots, okay? Now, in the context of that, what is interesting is that we see sometimes the political dynamics. You know, we look at them and we can catch some of them. We can see sometimes the economic dynamics. But what we sometimes miss are the legal dynamics of what all this means. Because you can't possibly be thinking that all of these unions are going on, all this networking that's happening, and that there isn't going to be a legal effect, something that's going to ultimately affect your rights, not just here where you are, but wherever global white supremacy is. And this particular brother stands right now as our champion. He stands as our champion because he not only got the decree and he got all of the things that go along with that, he not only learned the law, but he decided to do something that Dr. Amos Wilson talked about today. When Dr. Wilson talked about what was going on with the U.S. meeting the Japanese, he said the scary thing for the U.S. is they walk into a business meeting and it looks at first like they're sitting across from Japanese businessmen, but those businessmen are samurai. Samurai. They are warriors. They have come to cut heads off. Okay? And when we talk about that kind of warrior spirit, that kind of warrior consciousness, there is no one who has stepped into a courtroom and done it better than this brother, who is our teacher today, Brother Attorney Alton Max. All right, you know the theme, the effects of global white supremacy. It is going to be covered from our guests from several different perspectives. One historical, one psychological, and one legal. We will start with our elder in the historical, Dr. John Henrik Clarke.
Thank you again. We have a lot of work to do, short time to do it. After we have finished the 3 lectures, there should be 4, but we're going to settle for 3. The lecture will be transcribed. All of us will take our respective lectures and build in the documents, and I will edit all of the lectures into a book and start. The book will contain, in addition to an extension of what we have said here, the major documents on the extension of global white supremacy all over the world, how it started, Greek attitudes, Roman attitudes, even the attitudes of semi-white people, like the Arabs, who will separate custom from religion, things that you believe to be the truth that is really folklore. It's so difficult to get people to recognize that certain things were imposed on you that were alien to your society, they came out of other societies, and you accept these things and willing to kill each other over them. And there's a word of truth in it. All right, we don't have time for any form of chit-chat. The focus of my talk, all too short given the subject, the focus of the talk will be global white supremacy from the end of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century and the African independence explosion. Now, what had happened at the end of the 19th century, African people all over the world had engaged in protracted revolutions and had given themselves something they need right now, something their children need right now, something all of them misinterpreted and removed from their memory, the longest revolutionary heritage of any people on the face of the earth. Giving up a true revolutionary heritage, they began to follow people who didn't know where they were going. They began to accept books called the Bible. They began to hear stories about the rescue of a Holy Grail. Number 1, wasn't holy. Number 2, wasn't laws. Number 3, wasn't there in the first place. There is an essential myth through the life of most of the people in the world. Now,
with the interpretation of the curricula as a feel-good curriculum, the criticizers of our desire for a correct curriculum have had nothing but a feel-good curriculum. But they don't want anyone else in the world to feel good. Now, if they stop telling lies about themselves and integrate our truth, maybe all of us can feel good together, and you have universal humanity other than global white supremacy. What the fight over the curricula is about their claiming things that they couldn't possibly have produced, because the things that they claim are older than their existence. They came up this morning on WWRL, a man or a lady, it called, reporting about some 12 gates. And the names of the 12 gates. Give me this name. Gates to the holy city. I said, that presupposes that I believe the story in the first place. It also presupposes that I accept Jerusalem as the Holy Land. And I do not. I have no Holy Land outside of the physical property of Africa. So what you are calling Jerusalem and what you are calling the Middle East or Western Asia was once an African colony and an extension of Africa. But the first holy city that the Africans declared or any other people declared in the whole world is Abydos. And that city is still there intact. Jerusalem has been destroyed several times. And Jerusalem was given to us out of someone else's folklore, while we ignore the city we built with our own hands, still standing, not holy by us, because someone else told us another city was holy. Now, as we came down to the end of the 19th century, the Africans had been engaged in anti-colonial war. Global white supremacy had manifested itself in the form of slavery. We had had 400 years of it by now. Europe had recovered at our expense. The products from Jamaica, Haiti, and other West Indian islands had restored the economy of Europe. South America, that mulatto continent, contributed very little to Europe then, contributed very little to Europe now. The race in between was in conflict with itself, not was a conversation here, because these want to be whites. I wish the hell I was white, pretending that they are white. That's another lecture, another day. When I have enough strong men to protect me from the podium to the street where the car is running, Get me the hell out of here and keep me being killed. I will deliver the lecture on the role of the bastards in history. The people created by the coming together of blacks and whites who go through life, in most cases, debating whether they're loyal to their mother's people or their father's people, not knowing that every time they knock on their father's door, their father won't open the door, leaving them with no other door to come into but their mother's people's door. And yet, so many times they have no loyalty to their mother's house. In Africa, they had fought 100 years of colonial wars. These Africans who never wore a store-bought shoe or heard of a military school, in their fight against global white supremacy, had out-generaled some of the finest military minds of Europe. All right. And whose word do we have for this? A young British reporter named Winston Churchill, in a book called The River War, dealing with the British retaking of the Sudan, and another one called A Roving Commissioner, dealing with the Boer War in South Africa. These Africans did not concede that anyone had the right to take over their country. So the Asante Wars in what is now Ghana, the wars along the East Coast, engineered, brought into being by Islam, Europe, after chattel slavery was turned into another form of slavery called colonialism, a more sophisticated kind of slavery and more profitable. You're less responsible for the upkeep of the slave, and yet he has no choice but to work with you because you destroyed his way of life. He must now survive by serving you. You torn down his trees, you killed his farm life, you laughed at his gods, you told him his clothes was ugly so he's not wearing your clothes. You reduced him to a vassal by demeaning his culture and demeaning him. Some traditional Africans who would not wear their clothes or adopt their tastes decided to fight. They did not go to London, to Whitehall Street. They did not go and laugh at the smiling lady under the chandelier. The minute the African went to London and saw a chandelier and had a cocktail in hand, he was doomed. So global white supremacy was manifesting itself in many ways because they had produced a mechanism of control. Now having controlled the body, they wanted to control the mineral wealth of Africa. They knew then what you still do not know. Africa is and has always been the world's richest continent. All right. And we are a rich people who are poor because we have not understood our riches. That juvenile delinquent who came out of Europe shooting babies in the back and calling himself a superior man at least knew something about the African who befriended him. He knew that he was politically naive. At the end of the 19th century, the Africans had 100 years of fighting this supremacy. The European had created a literature trying to justify his superiority. This literature had to deal with the brain side, head measurement, a whole lot of things had absolutely no scientific basis. Now people looking for the missing link. The missing link cannot be possibly found any place except in Europe. So they created a man in Europe, took a skeleton, buried the skeleton, dug it up. Didn't have any ancient history, so he got to create some. In the meantime, there were Europeans debunking all of this. No one paid any attention to then or now. But in the closing years of the 19th century, there was a royal prostitute in Belgium named Leopold, who had houses of joy in different capitals of Europe, and he was spending a whole lot of money on these houses because he kept them the year round and sometimes could use them about once or twice a year. He's looking around for capital. There are nations in Europe who did not get in on the slicing up of Africa. They would call a conference at Berlin, where they would split up the rest of Africa, but all those got a little muscle. The Germans got a big slice. The Germans got 4 nice pieces. Southwest Africa, now Namibia, the Cameroons, Togoland, now Togo, and Tanzania. They began almost a rehearsal for Nazism in Africa because the civilian governor of Southwest Africa was Jewish. The military governor was Herman Goering's father.
No.
If I didn't know what the documents, I wouldn't be saying it. Now, with these colonial wars being fought, African kings, so-called chiefs, been either driven into exile, driven to suicide. What have we got now? In the closing years of the 19th century, you got missionary-trained Africans who are now petitioning the European, appealing to his conscience, not knowing he had no conscience, where power is concerned. There's no conscience to appeal to. Thou shalt not, the religion that said thou shalt not was meant for you. He gave that to you. He didn't intend to obey. Now after the Berlin Conference, and France getting more colonial territory, Germany getting colonial territory, Belgium getting the big Congo, Portuguese getting a little piece, all of the gangsters agreed on the slice. No African attending. And at this conference, an American Stanford allegedly attended the conference, saying as his rationale that the Congo might one day be a place to settle American blacks. Abraham Lincoln went through that same charade. Now you want to know what would have happened had Abraham Lincoln not been shot. I'm sorry he got shot. But had he not been shot, he had a movement to get all of us out of here. Even to the corner of Brazil, any place, let's get you out of here. And why he did not believe in slavery, because it was an unwieldy labor system. He didn't believe in your presence and said point blank, you will never be the social equal of a white person in any case. So while you are welcome celebrating Lincoln's birthday, do a little sobering thinking and read Lerone Bennett's famous article, Was Abraham Lincoln a White Racist? He asked the question and he answered the question affirmatively. He was.
All right.
Now, as we come down to the end of the 19th century, Africa is shifting gears. The warriors are leaving the field. The missionary-trained African activists are moving on the field. In Ghana, a brilliant politician, E.K. Hayford, is in charge of the youth that exiled King Prempeh and his cousin, Ye Asantewaa, who led the last of the Shanty Wars. And these wars were really wars to maintain European control over Africa, therefore a part of global white supremacy. At this juncture, we see North Africa coming under the French. We see the Arab, who's a colonizer and a slaver, being colonized. We saw resistance coming within this whole structure. And yet we see an intellectual movement existing in Africa in reaction to the continuous presence of the Europeans. Along the coast of East Africa, Somalia, a man named Muhammad bin Abdullah Hassan, the British called the Mad Mullah, had fought the British up until about 1923. Along the coast of West Africa, the Asante Wars in Ghana had lasted from 1805 until 1900, when the exiled Ye Asantewaa. After the exiled Ye Asantewaa, Casey Hayford started a campaign for the return of the royal families and converted that campaign into a fight for independence. And when he died in 1931, he sent for a young student, Joseph B. Dunkwa, to send for J.P. and said, J.P., the mantle is yours. Joseph B. Dunkwa, in turn, had a young student under his wing called Francis K. Nkrumah. Francis K. Nkrumah, after attending the Pan-African Conference in 1945 in Manchester, England, was broke and in London, and like a whole lot of Africa, eking out a mere existence, serving the unfulfilled British woman. Sinclair Drake, unfortunately deceased now, he says, when we get together, he says, John, one of these days I'm going to tell a real story about these African heads of state and what they had to do to get along. I said, Sinclair, have another cocktail. Sinclair, have another cocktail. I'm going to tell a real story. He never, the real story. I'm glad he never told the real story. My main point is that Joseph B. Dunkwa sent for his former student that until the end of his days he addressed as Francis K. Nkrumah. He never called him Kwame, just like he was in the classroom. And Nkrumah, being brought home to take the mantle of leadership from Dunkwa, got impatient. And instead of waiting for the mantle to be handed to him traditionally, seized the mantle and led the country to independence. Had he waited for it 2 more years, it could have been done more peacefully. There could have been a mixture of tradition and modernism. It would have been a much better state with the infusion our traditional government. Now, we were now becoming a prize to be captured because the land, the resources of Africa becoming a prize to be captured. Africans were now relating to Africans in the Caribbean and Africans in the United States. A great Caribbean figure, Edmund Blythe, had proclaimed and literally prophesied the concept of black studies in his inaugural address, Liberia College, 1881. He had already written his crowning masterpiece, deserved to be reread right now, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. All of us are mixed up on all the subjects. We're mixed up on all forms of religion. We're mixed up on all forms of politics. The European was still justifying the domination of other people through politics. All right, now, we had at the end of the 19th century a better Pan-African network when it took 2 months for a letter to be delivered than we've got right now. People were not boasting of any island they came from. The Africans understood the artificial nature of the state divided by foreigners. Some of them understood the artificial nature of the religion imposed on them by foreigners. All of this was a form of global white supremacy. All over the world, it began to happen. It had reached Asia. In China, the Europeans had their own courts. In Shanghai, there was hotels. The Chinese and dogs not allowed. And some of the people who will spit on you now were then being spit upon. All this is documented. Edgar Snow's work, another work called 400,000 customers. The only Chinese woman that could go into one of the hotels had to be a prostitute or a cleaning woman. This kind of humiliation. The British had reduced an entire nation to dope, to opium. You think you can't survive crack? They were worse off than you ever were. If they survived it, you can survive it. But you ain't gonna survive unless you crack some head. In the 1880s, an admiral named Perry kicked open the door of Japan, told them, trade with the West, whether you like it or not. No, it's earlier than that. The Japanese would mind their own business. The silkworm, making that beautiful kimono, wooden shoes. Didn't even have a decent wheelbarrow. Never heard of a Toyota or a Dodge. When people are asleep, sometimes it's best to leave them alone. Now, I'm going to show you what they did that you still got to do until you stop. Until you do it, you are jiving about independence, about freedom. A Japanese educator called in the youth of Japan and told them what had happened. And he sent them to the leading schools of the world, to get that information, get that technology. And if they smear that body waste in your face, apologize for having your face in the way. So he sent them to MIT. They went to military schools in the United States, wouldn't even let a black person sweep the floor. 2/3 of all the field officers that faced America in the Pacific War were trained in America. Every field officer practice training. Virginia Military Academy was the main trainer. Black men don't, it's not even there, even now. My main point is that by 1905, the Japanese had learned enough to take on a European nation. And when the Russians started messing with them, they started kicking butt. And they defeated them.
Right.
And this shocked Europe so much until they began to propagate something called the Yellow Danger. This is beginning in the basis of anti-Asianism. Manifests itself in the stereotypes in the movies. A Japanese detective called Mr. Moto, Fu Manchu, Charlie Chan. And what do we have? That's been fed, their control over the movies. All of this is global white supremacy. Their control, their colonization of the Bible. They're sitting down Sunday school lesson with all white angels. Every single thing that came out of the European mind was meant to facilitate his control over the world. He's got no hesitation about it, and he's got no apology. You buying his hook, line, and sinker. You buying his concept. All religion is good when it is practiced good. All religion can be bad, but all religion that I know of is used for one people to control another people. Because they killed the spirituality in the religion itself. The missionaries were handmaidens of colonialism, and they still are. The African trained by the missionary began to react. So global white supremacy was manifesting itself in the commerce of the world of that day. The Caribbean islands now realize that while their independence, their emancipation came 30 years before Black America, their emancipation was a fake, and ours was a fake. And when you boasted, all you're saying that my bakery came before your bakery. So many of them, the rebels, went back to the hills. The best example is uprising in Jamaica, 1865, in Moret Bay. George Gordon and that crowd. Now, in the United States, because of the pressure, we had produced the greatest line of intellect of any people living outside of Africa. The climate was cold in New England. You could only work a slave 6 months a year. So you begin to have slave carpenters, slave craftsmen. You would farm them out. You begin to develop industrial slaves. They made a little money on the side. They could buy their way out of indentury. It wasn't quite as difficult. They began to read, write, run newspapers. Frederick Douglass escaped into this group. Yet the concept of getting back to Africa was prevalent. 5,000 Africans in this country had fought with the British against American independence. an incident left out of history. After the British lost the war, they had to get rid of them. So the British sent them to Canada and to Nova Scotia. Global white supremacy is now manifesting itself in the failure to acknowledge that every American citizen is a citizen. If you're a citizen, you need no civil rights movement and no civil rights action. The fact that you need it proves that they have not acknowledged you as a citizen. In a nation of immigrants, we are the immigrants against our will. We are the only immigrants who are invited here. Right. The nature of the invitation will not be discussed here. They were anxious to get us here. We had an affirmative action program waiting for us. No unemployment. No pay either. We transformed this nation. My main point is that the first half of this 19th century, we were fighting against global white supremacy in the Back to Africa movement that had started during the American Revolution, the movement to settle Liberia, 1847,